Okay, we are still waiting for a few more to join us, but we are going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pat Sauer. I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa Stormwater Education Partnership. Joining me is Dr. Tom Rosberg, botanist, ecologist at Drake University. And Ben Curtis is here with ISWEP, who is handling the sort of the background platform of Microsoft Teams. So I want to welcome you all to the 2021 Weeds, and Invasives 2 webinar. So we had such success last year when we did a road tour of different native Iowa plants and looking at different seasons, and then also looking at in different locations across the state. We're going to do the same thing this year, only we're focusing on weeds and invasives. So with that, what we're going to do this year is this is meant to give you as much information as you want. So you can, as we're going through, you have two options. You can unmute yourself, stop Tom, ask questions, or you can use the chat area in Microsoft Teams, which should be at the top of your screen. If you all want to take a look at that. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to, instead of playing the entire video throughout and then stopping, we're going to play the video with a grouping of plants, stop the video, and then Tom is going to talk about management of those specific weeds/invasives. Feel free to ask any questions by unmuting yourself or by using the chat area. And of course, if you have stories to share as well, I think we can all learn from each other as well. So with that, Ben is starting the recording of this webinar, and he, is going to be starting the video, everyone. So I think we're all set. So let's go ahead and get started on the video.
Sounds good. And then once I get started, Tom, if you just want to nod your head, yes or no, if you can see and hear, all right. But yeah, we'll start the video and then stop it a few minutes in to talk about some Iowa State weed code, and then look at a few documents for that, and then kind of pop back into the video. So here we go.
Ben has emailed you all a handout that shows you the different plants and common and scientific name, and you can write notes on that as well. And Ben will also be posting a link to that handout, as well as the direct link to the Iowa code that we will discuss for weeds and invasives. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started on the video.
You know what, Pat, let me just do that really quick, because I think once I start the video, my screen's going to be locked up. So let me put those links in quick.
And I think what we could do to make sure everyone finds the chat, I know we just tried this on the previous webinar, if you could please use the chat, let us know what city, community you're in and what the weather is like there today. So go ahead and test out that chat area.
I'll start, I guess.
Okay.
Seems like it's sunny out.
Yep, it looks like it is a sunny and pleasant day, and you all have figured out where the chat area is for the majority of you. So thanks all for responding, and Ben has posted the links. Let's go ahead and get started with the video.
All right, here we go.
Hi, this is Pat Sauer. Welcome to the Weeds and Invasive series of webinars. We're traveling around Iowa, and we have Dr. Tom Rosberg from Drake University who's going to join us shortly and get us started on the tour this year. So welcome and stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Tom Rosberg, professor at Drake University. And here we are standing on a pasture, a privately owned pasture in central Iowa. We're going to start the webinar series on weeds and non-native plants. So when you think about weeds, there's actually three terms probably that we need to kind of think about a little bit there. There's the term weeds, there's the term non-native plants, which means, of course, a species that's not native to a particular place, not native to Iowa, not native to North America, for example. And then there's the term invasiveness. So let me just kind of see if I can kind of clarify some of those terms for you, because we're going to be focusing on non-native plants. So non-native plants, again, that's pretty easy. They're not indigenous to a particular place. Now, sometimes the term weeds is also applied to non-native plants because quite often, most of the things we think of as weeds are also non-native plants. I think most people probably would agree that a weed, the term of what we mean by a weed is simply a plant that we don't want to have growing in a particular place. So we can talk about weeds in our garden, or weeds in our flower beds, weeds in our crop fields, weeds in our pasture, whatever that species is that is essentially not supposed to be there, or is somehow maybe hurting the potential for crop production or forage production. We think of those as weeds. Again, most of the time we would probably find that those are also non-native species. Then the term invasive species is used when we're describing a plant. Again, not saying whether it's native or not really, but invasive species as one that is capable of establishing and colonizing in a habitat, and because of its ability to compete, its ability to disperse and establish well, maybe its ability for chemical inhibition of other plants, because of its aggressiveness, its vegetative growth. It's got some characteristics that really help it establish and increase the population size, increase the number of individuals in that population rather quickly, and therefore then sort of start to overcome and affect the other species. Quite often an invasive species, again, is a non-native species. So again, a lot of times there is a strong correlation there, because quite often the one reason a species can be so invasive is because it is non-native, because again, that helps it to escape its evolutionary determined control species. Wherever it evolved, wherever it's from, there's usually a community there of other species that it interacts with in ways that would tend to limit its growth in some way. These would be pathogens, herbivores, predators, competitors, again, that it evolved with. When it somehow gets moved from Asia or Europe to North America and leaves those other species behind, the species that help to regulate its population size, it essentially escapes those, comes into a novel environment where, again, it doesn't have any of those species. It becomes sort of a super species in a sense then, and has a great advantage, again, over native species, which, again, do have a set of species that do help to control their population size. So it is kind of a mixed bag of things that we're talking about, but I would say, again, weed, a species we simply just don't want growing in a particular place. A non-native species or exotic species, one that did not evolve in a particular place, and invasive species, those that are able to establish and overcome other species in an environment. So we're going to take a look at, again, this.
So yeah, I think we should stop here and pull up the state code and just kind of have a little bit of a discussion on those three definitions, if we could, Tom and Pat.
Okay, and as we mentioned earlier, you were sent the link to this, so you have it. So this is a direct view of Iowa Code Chapter 317 on weeds. So Tom, if you care to, and Ben, if you could scroll down, look at the definition in the code of what a weed is, and then let's focus on the different categories that they provide.
Right. I think we'll see here that, again, a weed is, and I think the best way to think about it is just the term weed is used in a subjective manner. So again, a weed is based upon what a person thinks, you know, so a weed to me may not be a weed to you in general. But the law, as we see here, Ben is scrolling down there, you can see there's, of course, in order for this to be a document that guides the management of species that are deemed to be weeds, there needs to be a definition. So clearly they're defining, again, a plant is a weed on the basis of the potential for it to impact economic growth, production of crops. I think it says there, based on the finding that plant is competitive, persistent, pernicious, and may directly or indirectly injure or cause damage to crops, other useful plants, livestock, or poultry, irrigation land, public roads, fish and wildlife resources, or the public health. So very, very broadly defined in terms of the negative impact that this plant may have. So there are some different classes. We see that I think there's two different classes. The primary noxious weeds, there's a list there. Then I think there's another secondary list. So I guess I'm not quite sure because I don't use this day in and day out or anything, but I think the primary ones are the ones that need to be controlled from a legal standpoint. Does anyone else know about this?
So for those of you that may use this reference to code in your work, anyone wish to comment on it at all? You can either unmute yourself or use the chat area.
As we're looking at these species here, these are definitely all non-native species I'm seeing here, except for one. Here's horse nettle. Horse nettle is not a non-native species. That is a native species. So again, the origin of these species isn't really a factor here in deciding whether it's a noxious weed or not. And I'm sure there's probably maybe some other native species on the secondary list, but let's see, here's a secondary list here. Cockleburr is actually a native species. And let's see, Rumex altissimus is a native species. Of course, several species of sunflower, Helianthus, are native. And I think, well, I know that that thistles, we see some thistles here. There was a thistle, I think, on the primary list. There's Canada thistle right there, bull thistle, two thistle species there. Of course, there's native thistles, and I know for quite a long time, native thistles were also listed either as primary or secondary, but they have been just recently, that has changed. They're still, I think they still kind of show up someplace, but you're not required to control the native thistles. Now, that was something that a lot of wildlife managers, and especially those interested in native ecosystems and promotion of plants as pollinator species, those thistles are incredibly important to many pollinators, butterflies, especially in bees. So there was an effort to educate the legislatures, I guess, about that, and it was successful in so much as at least the native thistles have been taken off the primary list or secondary list.
Someone has a comment, no wild parsnip on the list. If you scroll up, I guess I'm not seeing it on the list here, but Ben, if you could scroll up again.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out there is the invasive plants section as well, but I can go back quick. Well, yeah. I didn't see it on the initial list. Let's see here. So in the secondary.
Do we know what the difference between secondary and primary is? Is it just level of concern?
We do not. We essentially, and we're seeing that wild parsnip is not listed, and there will be other species that are not on this list. Just to make you aware that each state typically has a reference to their code that lists weeds and invasive species, for those of you that are not aware of that. So we don't want to spend that much time on this, just to let you know that there is some basic information available, but as Tom will go through, not all those species that we consider weeds or invasives may be on this list.
That's for sure. There are many more invasive species than what's listed here. There was that list at the end, as been pointed out. And I think when we think about invasive, again, the way they've defined a noxious weed, it should, any species that's really, truly strongly invasive should probably be on that list.
That's sour.
I can think of many species that I would consider to be really potentially damaging species to ecosystems, to people's belongings, people's forest systems, prairie plantings, of course, that aren't on the list. So I'm not sure what all the policy and procedure is to put a species on this list, but.
Okay.
So I would say we'll go on next to the rest of the video. Thank you, Tom.
Sure. This pasture here, well, since we're going to be looking at non-native species and maybe having a focus on invasive species as much as possible, we're going to need to find environments where we tend to see more of this non-native component. And so that's not so much. I mean, you can certainly find them in natural areas, but we're going to find more of them probably and have more diversity and opportunity to see and talk about more species. If you look for places in the landscape that are disturbed, have at least some kind of use going on, have more early successional types of environments. Because again, that's another feature again of sort of a weedy species, is one that is adapted to that's adapted to early successional types of environments. So a pasture, parking lots, disturbed areas are what we'll be looking for more in the landscape. And again, this is a cool season pasture here. We can talk about many species here because most of these species, again, being a cool season pasture, are not native. So we'll start with some that we see right here in front of me. We'll go over here and take a look at this this one that's just got some basal leaves right here. It's a real common species that we find in usually a little bit damper soils. You can see the leaves here. I'll go ahead and just pull one leaf up. It has these very long basal leaves, curly, kind of wavy margins along the edge of the leaf here. Many of you probably know this. This is curly dock, Rumex crispus, in the smartweed family. It is somewhat of an invasive species, and in some places I think you could argue that it might be tending to be that way. This is just in the vegetative state here, of course, and it's too early to see any of the flowers or fruits yet. But pretty distinctive in the form of that leaf and the curly, wavy margin along the leaf edge there. So it's a pretty easy one to learn. Right here in front of me is one that is in flower and probably we'll be seeing many species, quite a few species that are in this family. This is the mustard family. We can recognize mustards right away, usually by just taking a quick look at the flowers and seeing that there's 4 petals. The 4 petals are not fused in any way. There's usually 6 stamens if we take a closer look and count those. But many of the mustards are early summer, late spring types of species. This one is called yellow rocket. The yellow flowers give it that name. It's Barbaria vulgaris, the scientific name. And I guess as far as good characteristics, the lower leaves, mid-calling leaves on yellow rocket are fairly distinctive. They usually are pretty deeply lobed, as you can see in these examples here. Now, yellow rocket is, again, you could probably describe it as a weed. The farmer who farms this area probably does not really want this out in the pasture. It's not anything that is helping the pasture be productive. So in that sense, this would be called a weed. It's also not native, of course, but it's not really that invasive. As we look across this pasture, we just see a few of them here and there. And in most natural environments, I never have really seen this becoming much of a problem. Many of the mustards, and we have another mustard right here, just a little ways away. This one here is a species of tumble mustard, Cicimbrium. There are a few that are in flower, and they have yellow flowers as well. And based on the flower, which we don't have right here, but based on the flowers I've seen on some other plants, it looks like this is Cicimbrium loeslii, a pretty common species of tumble mustard. The mustards are often annuals or biennials, and that means, of course, that they really have to come up from seed each year or every 2 years at least. And many of the annual species of mustards are what we call a winter annual, which means that they produce their seeds early in the spring here, and then the seeds will be dormant over the summertime. They break their dormancy over the summertime and then germinate in the fall. And there's a little bit of growth in the fall, just enough to produce a little bit of a small rosette plant. That rosette plant overwinters. It overwinters by being able to protect itself from freezing temperatures with antifreeze. And then because it's already that far along, when it starts warming up in the spring, just as soon as it starts getting warm, those little rosette plants can begin growth. And of course, they're way ahead of anything else at that time. And those plants then produce, the rest of the shoot system is produced, and flowers and seeds are made. And those seeds are then dispersed again at the beginning of the summer. So many of the species that are annuals and biennials, and we'll talk more about this later, and maybe we can cover it more in the webinar, but whether if you're dealing with something that's an annual or a biennial and you're worried about controlling it, a lot of what you really need to be thinking about is stopping the plant from producing seed, because it's that seed that's going to perpetuate that population. If you can limit that or reduce that, then slowly the plant's going to fade away. Now there's some others that are also here. There's this grass that is right all around us right here, all around me. You can see that it's producing flowers here. I'll just pull one up. One thing about dealing with non-native species, you don't have to feel bad about pulling them up, I guess, and to show them. Here we're getting the beginning of the flowers up here at the top. So this is a brome, annual brome. Based on, again, what I can see here of the developing florets and the spikelets here and the awns and so forth, it looks like it's Japanese brome. The amount of pubescence I'm seeing on the sheaths down here, and just sort of its overall gestalt look, it looks like Bromus japonicus, which again is an annual, non-native species of brome. It is, of any of the species that we've seen so far, I would say that this one is probably the one that has the capacity to become more invasive and again, more of a problem. It is sometimes a problem in prairies or grasslands. It is a big problem out west. There's a couple other species, Bromus tictorum, chess, and then there's probably 3 or 4 other species of annual brome that we can have. But Bromus japonicus is, I think, by far the most common one. And then we'll take a look at this clump of grass right here, because it is real common out here. But again, remember, we're in a pasture, and so these are grasses that the landowner has intended to be out here primarily for forage production. I'm pretty sure he doesn't want the Japanese brome, because that is more of a weed, but this is something that he does want. This is a forage grass. And again, based on just the vegetative characters that I can see here, I know that this is a species of fescue, but which species of fescue? I'm going to look at the base of the leaf right down here, where the ligule is, and where there's some little auricles, which are little leaf-like, or excuse me, little ear-like lobes that are on either side of the stem here. And by looking at that and seeing, just verifying, once again, I'll take another look here quick, but I don't see any hairs at all in that area. That would suggest that it's meadow fescue, which is Festuca pratensis. Again, common forage grass used in cool season pastures, both meadow fescue, this one, and another species of fescue, tall fescue, Festuca arundinaceae, they're both likely out here, and again, serving as one of the main forage grasses.
Pause there and talk about management of some of these, Tom. You're muted.
Tom?
You're muted, Tom.
Okay, yeah, let's take a look at these species. And again, really invite any of you out there to have some of your own observations or particular questions about these to just speak up. You can unmute and talk or put something into the chat. But just thinking about the ones that we just saw here, Rumus crispus, curly dock, as I said, that one is pretty easy to identify. There's only really one species, native species, that kind of looks like it. And we noticed that they were both on that noxious weed list. That's the native species is Rumex altissimus, usually called pale dock. And pale dock doesn't have the curly, wavy margins on the leaves, though, so it's pretty easy to separate. Also, Rumex altissimus, the native one, usually when it is in flower, it doesn't have that basal rosette of leaves that curly dock has. As far as control for curly dock, this is a perennial. So when you're dealing with perennials, then the idea is, of course, you have to, in order to kill the plant, you really have to kill the roots somehow. So I suppose, if you just had a few of them, you could use the old tried and tested technique that perhaps many of us have used, to remove thistles or wild parsnip. You can dig the plant basically, or use some kind of tool that will cut the plant off, maybe about 5 centimeters or so below the soil. Usually that's enough to prevent any resprouting from dormant buds that are lying at the base of the stem. If you have many of them, then an herbicide is going to be needed, of course, and any of the broadleaf herbicides would probably work. I don't know for sure just how effective they are. I haven't really tried them, but 2,4-D, something like triclopyr even, or even glyphosate, I suppose, would probably work. But it would be best to put that on the basal leaves, of course. You need to get it on the basal leaves. And so usually application in spring would be the best before it bolts and starts producing the shoot system and the flowers and fruits. Or in the autumn, you could do it on young rosettes of leaves that are just beginning to grow. Barbaria vulgaris, the yellow rocket. Again, you would use some kind of, if you wanted to spray it, again, some kind of basic broadleaf herbicide there. But again, like I said, with a biennial or an annual, again, another idea here would just simply be to prevent it from making seed. That's going to eventually take away the only resource really it has to maintain itself. There is coming up from seed. Cecimbrium, there are 3 species of Cecimbrium. I just wanted to mention that in Iowa. And the Cecimbriums as a whole are annual species. They don't have clasping leaves like Barbaria vulgaris does. It has, and that's another characteristic that I didn't mention in the video, but if you look at the base of the leaves, there'll be, the base of the leaves is going to kind of go around the stem a little bit and sort of clasp that stem. And another thing with mustards is it's always important in terms of identifying the mustard we have is the fruits, whether or not the fruits are, which are called either siliques or silicals. In the siliques are fruits that are much longer, and it's sort of the rule of thumb is more than 3 times longer than wide. Or if it's less than 3 times longer than wide, then it's a silical. And yellow rocket has siliques that are over 1.5 centimeters long or so, and those siliques are going to be pressed up against the stem as those fruits mature. Those slender fruits are going to be pressed or standing vertically and pressed up against the stem. That's another way to help make sure you've got the right species. Also, it doesn't really have hardly any hairs on it at all. Cecimbrium, the tumble mustards, they don't have the clasping leaves. They've got leaves that are much more lobed and divided. They've got usually some type of pubescence on most of the plant. They also have siliques, but their siliques are more than 10 times longer than wide, so they're really long and slender. But there are 3 different species of Cecimbrium, and the one that we had there, again, did look like it was Loeslii. That's because the fruits are, well, we didn't have any fruits, so I was just basing that on the flowers, but 2 of the species of Cecimbrium will have fruits that are spreading. That means that they basically are pointing more or less outward. And then one of the species, Cecimbrium officinale, has fruits that, like in yellow rocket, are erect and pressed up against the stem. So for both of the mustards, again, it would be a matter of you could certainly go out there and spray them if you wanted to. Again, you're going to primarily be spraying the lower leaves, or again, just prevent them from flowering. That could involve just simply cutting them off, removing the flowers, so that the flowers don't produce fruits. Now, another option I think I'm going to try on some problem areas just right where I live here, where I've got a bunch of mustards that come up each year. We're going to see one of them a little bit later on, shepherd's purse, is that because they germinate in the fall, and they produce those little basal rosettes. That's all they do in the fall. They just germinate and produce a little cluster of leaves. And of course, that again is the part of the plant that overwinters. What I think I'm going to try is going in and spraying those little basal rosettes with something again like glyphosate or again 2,4-D or just some broadleaf herbicide in the fall, because those basal rosettes should be pretty susceptible to absorbing that then. And if you can kill it then in the fall, then obviously you're not going to have that basal rosette surviving over the winter and coming back in the spring. Any comments or questions about those species?
We do have a comment and a question. The question is Japanese brome grass the same as cheat grass?
Well, yeah, so Japanese brome is usually called Japanese brome, is Bromus japonicus, but Bromus tectorum is sometimes called cheatgrass or downy brome or downy chess. So cheatgrass, chess, those are other alternative common names for these annual bromes. Again, I said there's about 5 or 6 of these annual brome species that we can have in Iowa. By far, Bromus japonicus and Bromus tectorum, which I would use the term Japanese brome, and downy brome or downy chest for those two species, they're the ones you see the most. But basically, cheatgrass is referring to the same group of annual brome species.
And then a comment from Jennifer. Curly dock makes a lot of seeds that she likes to remove from a site if there are not too many of them. Good
idea. Anytime you can prevent any plant from producing seed. I mean, it's a perennial plant, so it's going to live for a while. But obviously, you're helping long-term prospects if you can remove those seeds. You don't need more of them, obviously. So if you can prevent the plant from spreading by making more seeds, and curly dock primarily is going to increase its population size by seed. I don't think it has much vegetative growth. So you would be helping to prevent that.
Okay, well, good comment, good question. Let's continue on with the video.
Will do.
Right, we are working on identifying non-native species, weedy species, invasive species, and we're looking at a pasture here in central Iowa in the first part of May. So we're seeing things mainly, a lot of things are going to be in their vegetative state. We're going to be seeing a few things at least in flower, some of the mustards, but we'll probably see some of these species again later on. So this will hopefully help you see them both in early vegetative states and then later on see them in their flowering states. We've moved down the stream a little bit here and we found a few more species of non-native plants. The first one we're going to take a look at is called black medic, Medicago lupulina. I have a little bit of a sprig here of one of those stems. It's a low-growing plant. I can point to it down here. It's a legume. So as many legumes have, it has trifoliate compound leaves, so 3 leaflets. The leaflets are really small. They have a really strongly angled or wedge-shaped base and are pretty hairy. This one has a few little flowers that are beginning to form, and the flowers are really tiny. They form a little sort of spherical cluster. That's one of the ways that you'll recognize it, those small little heads of yellow flowers. Medicago lupulina, or black medic, is introduced into this pasture like some of the other legumes we're going to be seeing here in just a little bit. The clovers probably, again, of course, has an important nitrogen fixer as a way to, again, provide some extra quality forage for the cows. Of course, this is a species that in a native environment, native prairie, for example, we wouldn't want to see it. Medicago lupulina is sometimes a problem in sites that are undergoing reconstruction, especially if they've been in a pasture or cool season grass. But I find that it's really not all that invasive. I don't think it really is too hard of a plant to get rid of. Medicago lupulina, black medic. We found some more legumes. These two are a little bit more important. Red clover first, right here. So if we have flowers, of course, red clover and white clover are pretty easy to tell apart. Without flowers, we have to just use the vegetative characteristics that we can see here in these plants. And I find that most of the time red clover and white clover are pretty distinctly different when you look at the compound leaves. These are trifoliate, or 3 leaves with 3 leaflets. I'll hold up, here's a red clover, here's a white clover, some white clover leaves, get rid of the grass there. And so you can see that there's a difference in size. Generally, white clover leaflets are a lot smaller. These right here, compared to the red clover leaflets over here. Red clover leaflets usually have a pretty well-marked chevron, this white marking we can see on the surface, upper surface of the leaflets here. And white clover generally lacks that, although you can see maybe a bit of one sometimes, just a slight one. Another characteristic that I can see with my hand lens is the red clover leaflets here are pubescent. There's hairs all along the petiole here. There's hairs on the ventral side of the leaflets here, whereas the white clover leaves are glabrous. There's no hairs at all really on any of these. So again, when they're in flower, this one's white, this one's red, much easier to distinguish then. Now, of course, out here again in the pasture, they're important nitrogen fixers to help increase, the growth of the grasses. But in a prairie planting, for example, these are really a problem. And again, probably I've seen the most difficulty usually in a situation, again, where you have a former pasture or cool season grassland that has clover in it, and then you're trying to convert that to a prairie. You really need to take extra time to get rid of the clovers before you put any seed down. Red clover, I think, is probably the more difficult of the two species. It's the one I tend to see, causing the most problems. It's a little bit bigger plant. It will grow a little bit taller overall than what white clover does. So just on its pure size, it's a little bit more of a problem species. So this is Trifolium pratensis over here, red clover, Trifolium pratensis. And this one over here, Trifolium repens, white clover.
Okay, we'll pause, and Tom, if you could talk about the management of those species.
Sure. Well, and I should correct myself. There's Trifolium pratensis, not pratensis, for red clover. So I think, yeah, of those three species, the red clover is certainly the most problematic, I think, just because of its size. And this one, it's a perennial, of course, so an herbicide is going to be required there for the most part in order to deal with it. Now, you can always use other things to some extent, but cutting or mowing probably isn't going to be that much help because, it's generally a fairly low growing plant, and that might even be somewhat beneficial for it unless you can really cut it really down low. I'm thinking about using some type of mower. That would probably not help a whole lot. Now, if you could go in and if you didn't have a whole lot of them, you could go in with a brush cutter, of course, like a steel brush cutter with a steel blade on it, and because you can cut the plant off right at the base with that. In fact, you can cut it right down to soil. That would probably help. So again, cutting would only be really helpful if you could get low enough to, when you do cut it, that you completely cut all the top growth off. More than likely, again, on a large scale type of situation with, quite a bit of it, then that's not going to be very doable. So, fire could be used anytime you can burn it, and you're going to have fire move through when the red clover is greening up or, has been growing for a while. And that's certainly a possibility in the spring, mid to late spring. You're certainly going to hurt the plant. And so really, and this is going to be a repeated theme, throughout when you're dealing with a perennial species, usually the strategy is one that involves multiple stressors. In order to really be successful in removing a perennial species like this is you're going to have to stress it enough and repeatedly enough that you just completely weaken the plant and the plant dies. It's no longer able to sustain the roots. So perhaps a burn in the early spring. This would be probably my strategy if I could time a burn so that, again, it would top kill the clover in the spring or maybe even in the fall, and then come back and use an herbicide on the regrowth. The idea here is always that, you know, if you can get multiple stresses, so you can stress it once by burning it, and then it's going to you know, it's going to come back. It's going to utilize its root reserves, its energy in the root system to produce a new shoot. Then, of course, once it does that, and then if you kill it again, and again, that could be going out and just cutting it, or it could be, again, using some spray, that's going to stress it again. And usually, of course, an herbicide, depending upon the type that you use, will certainly top kill it for sure, and it may even, you know, translocate into the root system and actually be more effective at killing the roots. There's all kinds of information available on a variety of websites about herbicides and which ones seem to be the most effective. There's lots of research that's been done on these sorts of things. I looked up trifolium pratense here, and I found some research that suggests that, and this is actually was aimed more at removing it in a yard, in your lawn, but using herbicides that contain either dicamba, clopyralid, or fluroxypyr. Clopyralid, I know, is very effective. Clopyralid is what I would probably choose to use. It is especially, it's kind of known to be especially effective on legume species, and it's going to be the one that's probably recommended most for crown vetch. Clopyralid is can be found under the trademark names of Transline or Lantrell. Yeah,
so Tom, I have a question for you, and then someone has a comment too. If you had small patches of these weeds in your yard, especially the lower growing clovers at this stage of the year, time of the year, could you use a gas torch maybe to manage those?
Sure. Yeah. I have one of those myself, and I have used it to kind of take weeds out of my yard, you know, weeds popping up in the gravel. Yeah, that's going to be effective. Again, anything that, again, you're probably not going to kill the plant because it's got a perennial root system, and you're not going to kill the root system just by using a torch on it. But again, you're going to cause some stress to it. So that's the goal. No stress upon stress upon stress. No. The most difficult plants are going to require multiple stresses, and I think red clover is, you know, kind of does get into that category of being a challenge. Another one that we're not talking about here, but because we didn't see it out there, but that goes into the same category as with the clovers, is sweet clover. The sweet clover is different in so much as it's a biennial, or it's a short-lived perennial. And so again, the strategy of preventing it from producing seed is also one that's good there. But I've got sweet clover coming up in my prairie planting here, and I'm debating. They're really easy to find clumps right now, and I'm thinking about going out just with a backpack sprayer and spraying just those clumps, or I could wait a little bit and let it start to produce an upright shoot, and then go out there with a brush cutter and cut them off. Or if the patch is big enough, I'd use a tractor mower again and the mowing at that point in time again is to ensure that it doesn't produce any seed. Was there a comment that someone made?
There was a comment related to sweet clover. You touched. We will see images later on in the season, but the comment is, but sweet clover is one that can be problematic in her prairies. She does a lot of hand removal. They are tall and annoying.
Yeah, sweet clover is more of a problem species, I think, in prairie plantings for sure. We didn't happen to see any, you know, in this pasture, so we didn't cover it, of course, in this video. Well, I'm sure we'll see it someplace through the summer. I know I'm familiar with some of the methods that some of the natural resource managers for different kind of conservation boards use. And one that I know that Chad Gravy, of course, out in Pottawatomie County, uses is he'll utilize interns, the students that come and work over the summertime, and they'll just simply go out. And of course, they're dealing with really steep topography in the Les Hills, so they can't take a tractor out there and mow. So they'll just simply go out there with steel brush cutters and, you know, get 3 or 4 people mowing with steel brush cutters and just cut the stuff down. Again, you have to make sure it doesn't produce seed. It will go away if there's no seed left. Now that may take several years though, of course, because unfortunately many of these plants that are annuals or biennials and do rely on seed then to perpetuate the population, of course, they've evolved a seed that has a fairly long-term dormancy to it. In other words, can remain viable, has a long longevity of life in the soil. That's their strategy in terms of finding a disturbance, but not finding a disturbance in space, rather finding a disturbance in time. So you have to be persistent and don't let it go to seed.
The commented said, yes, she is her own intern in her prairie. Okay, right. I think we're ready to continue with the video.
All right, I found another mustard here. Remember, we're going to see probably quite a few mustards this time of year. I know it's a mustard again because of the white flowers. Mustards are usually white or yellow, and they have 4 petals. This one is pretty easy to distinguish. It's a species called Lepidium campestre, or field cress. One of the things as you start working with mustards that's going to be important is to distinguish whether or not the leaves have a base that is sort of lobed at the base. So the base of these leaves here have little lobes at the bottom. Those little lobes kind of wrap around the stem just a little bit. That's called auriculate clasping. So whether the leaves are clasping like these are, or whether they're not, they would not be clasping if they had a little petiole there. That's an important characteristic. Then for most of the time for the mustards, it really does help to have the fruits. Now we don't have any fruits yet here, we just have the flowers. But most keys, if you're going to be using a key, would probably make reference to the types of fruits and the size and shapes of those fruits. So most of the time you will be able to see mustard fruits because, again, they're early, usually pretty early in the growing season, and those fruits will just stay on that plant for several weeks. So again, this one is Lepidium campestre, field cress, based on the clasping leaves here. The base of the leaves are clasping. The leaves are sessile. There's no stem there, and just the white flowers. I have 3 more non-native species here we can take a quick look at. We're in a little more of a shady portion of this pasture here underneath some big trees. First one is this one right here. I'll just snatch a stem here, hold it up a little bit better here. So this one has square stems. So we know right away this is a mint. It has a little bit of a minty smell to it, although not that pleasant. This is Leonoris cardiaca, or motherwort. There's 3 species of Leonoris in Iowa. This one is, I think, the most common one. It's the one I come across the most. So again, the square stems, certainly an important clue here. The leaves are, as in mints, are opposite. And the Leonoris or motherwort leaves always kind of have a, I don't know, you might say sort of a look, looks a little bit like a gooseberry leaf. They have sort of an overall round or somewhat ovate shape with a lot of lobing, deep lobing going on in some places here. As they will have a very characteristically mint flower a little bit later on in the year. Motherwort is, again, non-native. I wouldn't put it into the invasive category probably from what I've seen. I see it occasionally, sort of mostly in more shaded environments, so forest environments, woodland environments, but not to a great extent. The next one right here in front of me, and there's quite a bit of it all around here, is another grass. So we're looking at another cool season forage grass. Here's a clump of it right here. Pull another stem up. This one is starting to form spikelets here at the top. This is orchard grass, Dactylus glomerata. Now, one of the characteristics that show up already here is the shoot here, the stem is somewhat flattened. In fact, as you go a little bit further up here at the top here where the last leaves have come off, it's really flat through here. When the flower heads, the spikelets are fully formed, it's got a pretty characteristic inflorescence. The spikelets are all really tightly clumped together in small little groups. And one more right here is another mustard. Surprise, surprise, right? So this one does have the fruits well formed. And so when you have those fruits, boy, that's a big help, because the types of fruits, the size and shapes of them are a helpful clue to what you've got. So in the mustards, the Brassicaceae, we classify the fruits as one of two types. This type right here, we look at these, the size of these fruits, the length, we look at the length compared to the width. In fact, if we take the length to width ratio, if that is 3 or less, in other words, if it's less than 3 times longer than wide, we call that a silicle. If the fruit's much more slender and elongated so that it's more than 3 times longer than wide, we call that a silique. So this is clearly a silicle. The fruits here are just a little bit longer than they are wide. And that's just the distinctive size of them, the way that they are attached to the stem here. This is all characteristic of pennycress. The leaves, again, are sessile. There's no petiole here. They don't really have a clasping base in this case, but there's no leaf stem there. The leaves are attached to the stem by their base. Pennycress, Flapsea arvense is the scientific name for it. It has white flowers. Here's another.
We'll stop at this point, Tom, and if you talk about management of those species.
Yeah, well, first I want to make a correction. So this is a good time to stop. That one, the first mustard there that was labeled Lepidium, well, I called it Lepidium campestre, but I had told Ben that was misidentification. So that mustard was the vegetative form, and it was just starting to produce flowers of pennycress. Those two species are lookalikes, and so that's why, without seeing the fruits, it wasn't real clear which one it was. I was using just the vegetative characters, but there is a good vegetative character that I didn't key in on, unfortunately, there, and that is that pennycress or Thalassia arvense. Again, both of those two species there, those mustards were the same one, does not have any pubescence. It's a glabrous throughout the stem and on the leaves. And Lepidium campestre, field pepperweed or field cress, which again we didn't really see there because it wasn't the species that I thought it was. It has quite a bit of pubescence on the stems. So you just using the pubescence is pretty, you can separate those two species that otherwise look very similar in terms of the leaves, the way that the leaves are sessile or slightly clasping. Lepidium campestre has much smaller fruits, though. It does have silicles, but the fruits are much smaller than those large, almost the size of a penny. That's why it's called pennycress. In terms of management for, again, the mustards, it's the same story again, pretty much. Usually they're not really that invasive. These are non-native species, but they're sort of a symptom again of what the environment's like there. If the environment's disturbed, that's perfect environment for those species. Again, because they are a ruderal or early successional type of species. So again, as I said before, you could try spraying the rosettes when they germinate in the late summer or fall. If you wanted to try to control, a really large population. Otherwise, you just have to prevent them from going to seed, which can usually be done by mowing. The other one in there, Dactylus glomerata, that's a cool season perennial forage grass. So again, we didn't get a chance to talk about fescue, which again was one of those cool season perennial grasses in the first group of species there. But both Festuca pratensis, which by the way, Festuca pratensis, that's the old name. Now the currently used scientific name is Shedanoris pratensis. Again, this is a change in the scientific name. It's in Florida, North America. But again, both of these cool season perennial grasses, again, you'd use the same strategy for the most part. You could use fire, again, at the right time of the year, which is usually about right now. Those perennial, this goes along with brome too. Smooth brome is in the same category, are just beginning to sort of reach the stage where they're about ready to make the flowers, what's called the boot stage of the grass. So they're starting to form those florets and spikelets. And so when they're at that stage, the plants are usually more susceptible to stress. And so it's been shown in numerous studies, especially with smooth brome. Now, so I'm using smooth brome as an example here of another cool season grass, but I would think orchard grass would certainly be the same way. Burning it now really sets it back pretty well. Then if you again had some coming back, you could go in and use herbicide. And really for the grasses, probably what I'm seeing in some of the work I'm doing in terms of trying to control red canary grass, which is another species will be coming up here, but further down, is using the herbicide clethodim. And we'll talk more about that when we get to red canary grass. But combination, you could even use grazing. Of course, that's probably not an option for most of you, but again, combinations of grazing at the right time, fire at the right time, and then an herbicide, usually on anything that comes back to add that second level of stress is usually going to help a lot. What I have found and have seen in some literature is that applying herbicide in the fall to some regrowth or new growth is usually a little more effective than other times of the year. And I think probably the ecological reason for that may be, the biological reason for that may be that by weakening the plant, and again, an herbicide may not, we always think an herbicide is going to kill it. An herbicide may not kill it. An herbicide will weaken it though. It causes, quite a bit of stress. And so even if the herbicide doesn't outright kill it, it's going to stress it. And by stressing it in the fall, in theory, you could also do this by burning it too, but by stressing it in the fall, that makes the plant go into the winter season in a weaker situation. The root reserves aren't as strong, and so it may be more likely that, especially if we have a cold, longer than normal winter, that there could be some winter mortality that occurs. And it's really, when you think about, again, how to deal with some of these species, what we're really aiming at is again, multiple things that interact in some way, such that then the combined effect of two types of stressors is going to produce a greater effect than either of those added together.
Got a comment here, and I have a question. The comment is, always good to consider ground nesting bird species when considering the use of fire during certain seasons.
Correct.
Definitely. And a question I have is, so if you had said you could burn now, but if these species are in a prairie and you were to burn now, is that going to impact the growth of prairie species?
Well, interesting you should ask. I can send a paper to anyone who would like to read it on a research project I did several years ago. It was published in North American Conference of, the Proceedings of the North American Prairie Conference back in 2000. But it was a research project actually done in Story County along Interstate 35, where we addressed that exact question. Does burning late in the year, which is shown over and over again to be highly effective in reducing brome, for example, or other cool season grasses, what's that going to do to the prairie forbs that are already growing and in many cases are probably a foot tall? Well, what we did, just to make a long story short, in this research I did, it was over a couple years, and we actually burned 2 years in a row and followed plants for 3 years. We marked about 21, 22 different species of forbs that were present in the prairie. This is, again, doing this on a prairie reconstruction project along Interstate 35. We marked, I think it was 120 plants at least. So we had a large number of plants that were marked. By marked means we had a way of identifying each individual plant. We used some little metal stakes, so it allowed us to come back and find that exact individual plant. And what we did then was we marked plants. We had plants on control plots that were not burned. We had plants on spring burn plots that were burned twice. And the upshot was that there was no increased mortality on any of the prairie plants whatsoever. The mortality was equal on the control plots that were not burned and the spring burn plots that were burned. The only mortality, interestingly enough, that we saw was with a non-native forb, Artemisia, I can't think of the species epithet, but it's a non-native species of Artemisia. I'll probably think of it as we go along here. That was accidentally introduced into this prairie planting, probably as a mistake. We wanted Artemisia ludovinciana, which is a native prairie sage, and we ended up with a non-native species. So it was probably a mistake that somehow the seed got into the seed mix, and so that was not desirable at all. Well, as it turns out, again, this late burn was effective in removing it. And it just goes to show, again, something that I preach all the time, and that is that the non-native plant couldn't cope with fire, but the native plants can. The native plants have evolved with fire for millions of years. I mean, we know the North American prairie basically has been evolving at least for 6 to 7 million years. So again, with fire. So my philosophy is often, if you go out and you put back the environmental conditions that our native species evolved with, that's their evolutionary right, in a sense. They evolved with those environmental conditions in place. Other non-native species that often, again, are coming from another continent and coming from a place that didn't evolve with fire, they don't have that ability. And so you can separate. My goal is to separate the natives from the non-natives. And I think you can do that, again, by recreating the evolutionary environment that our native plants had. So the answer to that long answer is the research I've done. I can't speak for other projects, I guess, but the research I've done looked at that very question and found that fire did not increase mortality. Now, what you will see, of course, is those prairie forbs that get burned off in early May. They're going to resprout. They're going to come back from the root system. That's what they are adapted to do. They're probably not going to flower that much, though, because it is somewhat of a stress. And so we did find that flowering was reduced in those plants, at least for the first year. It wasn't the second year, as it turns out, but the first year flowering was reduced because of that late burn. But those plants don't need to flower. They don't need to produce seed.
So you talked about early May as being, say, late spring season, but what other times of year, what time of year do you consider late season for these burns? And I guess it would be, we know about spring and fall burns, but can you do summer burns? And then what months might you look at?
Sure. So when it comes to fire, my philosophy again, and what I say over and over again to folks in presentations is, you know, when you're thinking about using fire, you just don't go out and use fire because you heard someone say, oh, it's good to burn this prairie, so you go out and burn it. No, you design a burn, you think about a strategy, and you think about doing a burn as a way of using it as a tool to accomplish an ecological goal. So the only reason I'm burning right now, in fact, I'm going to be doing a burn tomorrow on my own prairie down in Ringgold County, is because I want to control brome. Brome is one of the most troublesome and invasive species we have in our prairies. And we know, again, from research over and over again, that a late spring, and timing is basically the first couple weeks of May, is very effective. So I will burn in May with the goal of reducing cool season non-native grasses. And it is especially effective, and the reason I'm doing quite a few burns this year, I'm burning a lot of my own reconstructions here, and I'm burning some other places, other sites around the state, is because I'm pretty sure we're going to go into a drought summer. And again, my research I did for my master's degree down in southern Iowa back in the late 80s showed overwhelmingly that a burn combined with a drought that follows after the burn during the next growing season, again, produces an interaction between the drought and the fire that has overwhelmingly devastating effects on brome. So by your spring burns are primarily designed to control non-native cool season grasses. Now, if you're trying to control trees, woody plants, if you're trying to exert maybe some effect on too much warm season grass, then you should be thinking about a burn during the later part of the growing season, what I would call the natural burn time. The natural burn time for prairies is not April and May. Lightning fires never occurred during that time. Our native plants did not evolve with fire during this time. They evolved with fire that occurred when lightning was most likely to cause fire in Iowa and the Midwest, and that would be from the 1st of July to about the middle of September. That, again, I can point to plenty of papers to show that and back that up, but that's the natural lightning-caused burn time. And so if you want to, again, use fire for different purposes, woody control for one certainly would be important there. And I guess another one would probably be to reduce the dominance of warm season grasses, which are native, but a lot of times some of our reconstructions have too much grass, or even some of our remnants have too much grass because we don't have bison and elk grazing them. So you could use a late summer fire to help do that. You could also use a late summer fire. A third reason why I would say use a prescribed fire in late summer is that you want to create more of a patchy mosaic burn and leave refugia for insects. That would also be accomplished by burning later in the growing season. Maybe not so much in a really dry year, but in a normal year, again, you're going to see more patchiness of the fire there. So again, just to recap that, it's all about, again, thinking about what your goal is, what you're trying to achieve, and then for fire at least, prescribing a fire and use it at the right time and in the right way. Timing is everything about fire. It's not whether or not you burn, it's when you burn. The time of the growing season that you burn has tremendous importance in terms of what the impacts are going to be.
Thank you, Tom. I think we're ready for the video to roll again. Ben?
Mustard to take a look at. Plenty of mustards this time of year. This one I would put into the weed category, a common weedy species. This is called shepherd's purse, Capsella bursopastorius. So again, it's got the characteristic 4-petaled flowers. Here we also have fruits. So the fruits, again, are very helpful in the mustards. And in this case, again, we have, very distinctive little fruits here. They're silicals because, again, of their size. They're less than 3 times longer than they are wide. And these have a very distinctive heart shape to them. So they are attached by the base of the heart, and then towards the top of the fruit, you have the two lobes that give it that heart shape. Capsella bursipastoris, shepherd's purse. This is, again, a very weedy species growing in yards, gardens. Here it's growing along a cattle trail. So it really likes disturbance. I found an individual of goat's beard. This is Tragopogon dubius. There's a couple of species of Tragopogon in Iowa, but this one is the most common one, and we see the most often. This one often, looks a little bit like a dandelion when it's in flower and has the same kind of dandelion flowers, forming those big puff balls, but larger than what a dandelion is. We don't quite have that yet. This is the flower bud right here, so it's just beginning to form, so it's a little ways off. But we can identify this one vegetatively pretty easily by these very characteristic leaves. It has these leaves that are very, very, very long, narrow, almost grass-like leaves. They're completely glabrous. There's no hairiness on any of them. And they're fairly crowded. A lot of leaves you can kind of see crowded onto this stem, this shoot. And they again taper to a very slender, narrow point. This one is, of course, again, non-native. It's not native to North America. I would not put it into any kind of invasive or really weedy category so much, though. Usually just see it scattered here and there. But the one that is right below me is much different. There's about 5 or 6, maybe 7 or so rosettes here of musk thistle. This is, again, a pretty common weedy species, and maybe even getting to the point of being somewhat invasive in some places. So we'll probably see these thistles as we go along during the growing season, and we'll see them later on in flower. All the thistles, have these, especially this species, and those that are biennials have these basal rosettes early on. I'm trying to pull a leaf off here, but it's so prickly I really can't get my hands down in there very well without getting stuck. The musk thistle, Carduus nutans is the scientific name. Probably the thing you would confuse this the most with would be bull thistle. Bull thistle and musk thistle, again, about the same size of rosettes, similar size and similar flowering later on. I think the thing that tells me this is musk thistle and not bull thistle is just the shininess and the glabrousness of these leaves. Bull thistle usually has a duller kind of grayish green look to the leaves. And again, this one is a lot more shiny. When the plants are in flower, you can tell them apart by the flowers. So musk thistles are something that probably need to be controlled. I think they might be one of those species that are on the noxious weed list.
Okay, we'll pause now and we'll have a discussion on management of those weeds/invasives.
All right, well, the most important one there, of course, is the musk thistle, or nodding thistle, as it's sometimes called. So Carduus nutans. It is a biennial. So again, back to some of the same kinds of ideas, so certainly preventing it from going to seed is going to be helpful, and that can easily be done by just cutting off the flower heads at some point. When I grew up on a farm in western Iowa, one of my jobs as a kid was to go out to the pasture and use a spade to basically spade out the thistles. And so that's another strategy called hand grubbing. It's another term that we use to describe that. Again, works fine if there's not too many of them, and you can do that. Again, you just have to use a spade or something that will cut the plant off, a little bit down into the soil, so that it's not able to come back from buds. Again, herbicides are always going to be a possibility at that rosette stage that we're seeing those plants. One thing nice about those rosettes is that you can really get the leaves. You can spray the leaves really effectively, and in most cases, because the leaves are so many there, you're not really going to have much potential for that herbicide to hit any other plants. You can focus it right on those basal leaves and get a good kill rate. So again, 2,4-D, clopyralid, dicamba, plicarum, those are all different kinds of herbicides that would be pretty effective there.
Okay, all right. Let's move on with the video, Ben.
So what you saw there at the beginning of that shot is this species right here. We have a single individual over here. Now we're standing in a reconstructed prairie. This was formerly an agricultural field a few years ago. So there's a prairie planting underway here. So again, this is a type of environment we would call early successional. We're also near the edge of it and near a little small riparian woodlot or small forest. And that's where all of this is coming from. That area over there, again, has a very dense understory of honeysuckle. So this is Lonicera mackii, a mure honeysuckle, one of 3 species of honeysuckle in Iowa and in the Midwest. This is a really good example of an invasive species and what we mean by that. Here's a good example of what the leaves look like. Honeysuckles are not too hard to tell apart vegetatively. If you have the flowers or fruits, it helps a little bit. But this one, mackii, has very slender, sort of tapering leaf points. You can see those forming on these young leaves here. They're not quite fully formed yet. Over there in the forest, it's very dense, and again, because of that, we can, I think, certainly agree that it's an invasive species. We see it all over the Midwest, of course. I've seen many environments, many places I've done plant surveys that are just almost to the point of impenetrable in terms of walking through because of the density of the plants. And so it is a huge concern. Has a huge impact on native biodiversity, of course, when it gets to that point, and a really huge challenge and struggle in terms of what to do about it. You can work on removing it, maybe little by little, but you're going to have to get probably the seed bank removed as well. There's probably seeds in the soil seed bank, and so it's not going to be that easy to get rid of. And of course, as you're trying to remove it, we need to be trying to get native species out there to take the place. So it is a huge challenge, and we can talk more about it during the webinar. A couple other species that I want to point out here in the reconstruction. One of them is this really small plant right here. We do see some larger plants about, and usually there's also some larger plants over there in the roadside. I'm going to go ahead and pick this, but this is something you should never do probably, because this is wild parsnip, Pastanaca sativa. And as I'm sure many of you probably know, this plant produces a sort of photoactivated chemical that for many people can cause really severe rash, skin rash. I've seen some students of mine come in contact with this up at Lakeside Lab, and the result was just a disastrous, large, oozing sore on their leg. I seem to be completely insensitive to it and have been all my life. Pastanaca sativa wild parsnip, this is a biennial. It is pretty common, and I would say approaches invasiveness in some prairies, probably both reconstructions like this, and I see it as a problem on native remnant prairies too. So as a biennial, again, one goal should always be to never let it go to seed, if at all possible. Do whatever you can to make sure that if it's in the flower stage or beginning to form fruits, that you somehow interrupt that by even just simply cutting it and picking up the material so it doesn't have a chance to even mature even a few seeds. You could get a little more aggressive probably and start digging it up, I suppose. They make some tools that can be used to dig the taproots out. But certainly one, again, that needs to be controlled. And then we have a really small little plant over here I wanted to point out to you. I'll pluck one or two here up so we can maybe see a little bit better example of it here. This is a species called tansy mustard. So again, we're looking at some more mustards. But in this case, this is a native species. Tansy mustard is recognized by its very heavily dissected or compound leaves here, almost fern-like little leaves here because they're lobed so much. Does have yellow flowers. You can see a few of those up here at the top. It's forming its fruits here as well. These are fairly short little silicles as well, less than 3 times longer than wide. But this, again, as I said, is a native species. So I think one thing that's important about this series, I know that, non-native plants aren't necessarily the thing we all want to be, enjoying and going out to see and view. But understanding which species are non-native and which are not, and how to identify them is important. This is a native species that I would put into the category of being a weed. And by that, I mean, the term weed is often used to describe what an ecologist would use a little bit more appropriate term, a ruderal species. A ruderal species, an R-selected species, is a plant that has evolved a strategy and is sort of designed to colonize disturbances. What we mean is an early successional species. So when a disturbance happens, and of course when this was prepared and planted as a seeding for a prairie, it most certainly was disturbed. It was disturbed repeatedly when it was a farm field. And that disturbance, again, is done in order to favor crops like an annual species. So the native species that are annuals often do serve this role as a ruderal species, an early successional species. One of their important functions in the system is to colonize these disturbances, get vegetative cover on them, and again, just begin the successional process that will gradually see that community change. So ruderal species like this, again, since it's native, are more appropriate at least. I mean, I would say it's not necessarily bad that this is here. It's just an example and helping to show that, again, this is a ruderal type of an environment. We would rather see native ruderal species doing what they are evolved to do in an environment like this, rather than non-native ruderal species such as that wild parsnip.
We'll stop at this point. And what you don't know, yes, I know this is not the perfect video. I think we've refined the sound on these videos this year, but Pat needs to work on her videography, especially with the zoom lens. But what you didn't know is there were some ticks crawling up my leg. I'm not real happy about having ticks crawl up my legs, so there was a little jiggling because I was trying to wipe them off. But go ahead, Tom.
Okay, right. Well, yep, there's going to be ticks out there. So, well, I think of those 3 there, the parsnip and honeysuckle, of course, the most concerning. And, back to the biennial, wild parsnip again, it's some of the same things again. You can keep it from going to seed. You can cut the rosettes. You can spray them. It's the same strategy, of course, you'd use for the most part on those thistles. Probably the herbicides are pretty much the same, although there can be some differences. And again, this is where it might be useful to do a little research online, check some websites that provide resources on how to control invasive species. For Pastanaca, I'm looking at, again, some of that work, and it's saying that the rosettes, again, can be sprayed with glyphosate. Can be some success there. If you're located in a place where there's no prairie plants and you don't want to risk the glyphosate, targeting or having an effect, some collateral damage on those plants, then you can at least protect the grasses by using something that's just more of a broadleaf herbicide. And some suggestions there are aminopyralids or dicamba as possibilities there. 2,4-D again has shown some effectiveness, picloram and triclopyr. So again, it's just a matter of spraying those rosettes, usually in the spring, or again, if you see some new rosettes forming in the fall, spraying them. So it's one thing about this, you can pretty much put plants into some categories: the biennials, the grasses, the perennials, annual species, and it doesn't matter too much which species it is. It's going to be the same strategy, of course, depending upon what type of growth form that plant has. The other one there that bears some time speaking about, and probably the same one that's coming up here, they're both going to be in the same category of an invasive woody shrub, is the honeysuckle, of course. And that one is pretty challenging, as I was saying there in the video. Number one, because often there's just so much of it. Some areas that are infested are just so completely infested that it's just an overwhelming and daunting challenge to even think about getting started. I was just out with a few students on Saturday down at Ewing Park in Des Moines doing honeysuckle work. We're removing shrubs there. It was a project that we call, they call uplifting, I think it's called uplifting. We cut the shrubs, and then we haul the shrubs. The zoo comes with a truck and hauls the shrubs down to the zoo and feeds them to the rhinoceros and the giraffes. That way you actually make some use out of those shrubs, and you don't have to pile them up there on site. They get carried off site. So when we do that, we're targeting saplings or little seedlings or shrubs that are probably just pencil thin stems, to maybe some stems were maybe as big as a couple inches in diameter. We always treat the larger stems. I usually use triclopyr in diesel in a little spray bottle, and make sure we treat that cut stem surface. That's going to translocate triclopyr down into the root system. And triclopyr is really effective at killing woody stems in that manner. Now, what I've also found doing work many places, out at White Rock Conservancy, we were doing the same thing, and we found it out there. And I also found this was true at Ewing Park. It kind of depends upon the condition of the soil, but if you have a lot of small ones, actually what we found there was just they're easy to pull. The smaller seedling sprout size, those that are less than 50 centimeters tall, and even some larger ones, that if it's rained recently, then they'll pull more easily most of the time. But that's something that you can try at least. And again, that's more effective because you can pull the roots out. When you pull a plant and you get most of that root, then it's not going to come back at all. What I've also tried at my place, because I've had some honeysuckle problems here, is because I'm cutting a bunch of them, and it's just nearly impossible to really go in there and effectively treat, especially when you're working by yourself. These other projects, we usually have students working, in pairs or at least in trios, and so as they're being cut, they're also being sprayed. Had the same operation going on at Wildway a couple of weeks ago. Then you can usually, keep track of which ones have been cut and get them sprayed. What I'm talking about, me working by myself, cutting a whole bunch of them, what I'll do is I'll just go in there with a brush cutter and cut them, not worry about putting any treatment on the stumps. But I have a follow-up plan. My follow-up plan, of course, is to come back when they sprout, and cut them again. And I did that a couple times last year. Now I've got some plants coming back, and so this week probably I'm going to go out and either haven't decided whether I'm just going to cut them again or I'm going to take out some foliar spray. The triclopyr can work either as a stump treatment. In that case, you use it with diesel fuel in a certain rate. If you want to use it just as a foliar spray to spray in the leaves, you can do that too. And that you just use with water. Again, little sprouts coming up that are only a foot tall are fairly bushy. And again, it's an easy time now to use a foliar spray and spray those leaves. And with that, you should expect, again, that herbicide is going to translocate into the roots and actually kill the plant. So there's a variety of ways to tackle this, depending upon what your situation is, how bad it is, how much help you have. But any questions?
Let's see. We had a comment. Someone was wondering if there were any native honeysuckles.
Yes, there are several species. They're usually found in pretty, somewhat pristine environments, forest environments. I believe, just thinking off the top of my head, that they're all pretty distinctive in that the leaves towards the tip of the stem, again, they're going to have opposite leaves, just like the non-native ones. But the leaves towards the top of the stem are what we would even say would be perfoliate. The bases of the leaves actually join each other. The two leaves on either side of the stem, their leaf bases are joined together, such that it looks like the stem is going through that leaf tissue. That's what perfoliate means. So yes, there are some native honeysuckles. So you really should, of course, be aware of that and have an idea of how to distinguish them. The three non-native ones, though, I think again, are pretty easy to separate from the native ones. And of course, if you're seeing something where there's just masses of them, most of the time, that's the non-native ones, of course.
Well, there are a couple cities that have had goats, have hired a company that rotates their goats in woodland areas, and I believe that has really knocked back the honeysuckle and perhaps the buckthorn. But yeah, any comments on that?
Yeah, so I've done a little research project on that, and that was done at Chautauqua Wildlife Area in Polk County. There, the concern was mainly buckthorn and honeysuckle and some other woody sprouts coming from trees, like even ash and elm and white mulberry. And we use goats there very effectively. So that would be a good strategy. Again, it kind of depends upon the situation and the logistics involved, but let me just give you a quick scenario. So one place where it is effective, the reason we ended up using it out at Chautauqua was that it was just massive amount of understory that was non-native. And again, a really effective way of dealing with that is not to go in with hand saws and pruners. That's going to take forever. So they go in with a forestry mower, this big machine that's designed to just pulverize and essentially shred and chip any woody plant that gets in its way. There's this big rotating drum on the front with these really sharp, wicked-looking knives, and it just, you can take down 6-inch trees with this thing. But what happens is that you definitely top kill it. I mean, you remove all trace of the plant above ground, but you splinter the plant so badly that you really can't, even if you tried, you can't really go back in there and do any stump treating. So it's impossible to do that. So now that means that you've got a part of the problem gone, all this massive above ground growth, but now you're going to get, one, sprouts coming back from the root system, and two, probably seedlings germinating from the seed bank. And so what are you going to do about those? Well, again, you have to have a strategy for that. You go into this knowing that you're going to have that, and you have a plan. Originally, the plan there was to use fire, but that didn't work because there wasn't enough fuel to carry a fire through the site. So that's how goats got involved. We brought in goats because, especially Boer goats, a particular breed that has a very high fondness for browsing rather than grazing. Browsing meaning that they prefer to eat the vegetation of woody plants. Grazing is, of course, eating grasses and forbs. And so what goats, of course, will do is they will just keep pulling those leaves off of those, anything that's sprouting back or any seedling that's coming up. The seedlings, they just kind of pluck the seedlings right out of the ground. And so they kill them just like that. But the sprouts, of course, are coming from a root system. And so they have to weaken those root systems. So by browsing it and keeping those goats hungry and keeping those leaves pulled off of those resprouting stems, the plant never has a chance to photosynthesize, and eventually the root system dies. So but that's something that's going to take time. It's going to take probably perhaps a couple seasons, maybe, although maybe one really long browsing season might work. At Chachaco, we used the goats for 3 years. And again, research-wise, statistically showed by collecting data that the goats were effective. They were effective in decreasing the amount of shrub growth and increasing. What was really nice was that on the plots that were, again, browsed by the goats compared to the control plots, which were not browsed, but were cut, we not only decreased the shrub density by the browsing goats, but we also increased the density and abundance of native plants, primarily sedges. So again, boy, it's just, there's so many different opportunities and different strategies. It just kind of depends upon kind of what your situation is, how bad it is, what your different options are. Goats are going to require fencing. We're going to require water, require more care.
Okay. All right. Well, let's finish up the rest of our video here.
All right. Here is another, what I would classify as invasive, very invasive woody shrub. This is Russian olive, Elaeagnus angustifolia. It's starting to form flowers here. So we could use those to help identify it, but we really don't need them because the foliage is pretty distinctive. Now there's two species of Elaeagnus. This one, Russian olive, is the most common. There's another one, autumn olive, that's also present. And the thing that distinguishes them, you can look at the leaves and the twigs with a hand lens, and the presence of these little rusty colored or reddish colored little scales on the young twigs and even sometimes on the leaves is indicative of Russian olive. This one is also got some little thorns on it, so it's kind of prickly. That makes it a little bit harder to deal with. And again, unfortunately, it was planted. It was brought here and planted for, I think, maybe wildlife purposes, but that's another example of, again, of a huge mistake. And it, too, is probably not quite as widespread as honeysuckle. I don't see it quite as much, but where it is, it can form, again, very dense stands, be very, very much of a problem. And I believe that it is probably a little bit harder to get rid of than the honeysuckle. So another very bad invasive species, Russian olive. We are standing again in this reconstructed prairie, 2 or 3 years old probably. It's on the floodplain of a stream here right beside us. And you saw in that shot, as it was panning this direction, down in the actual, right along the stream bank there, near the stream, there were some clumps of, larger clumps of green colored grass. We're seeing some more of that up here, and that is reed canary grass. One of the biggest problems in any kind of riparian environment, floodplain environment, any place where the soil is somewhat damp. It's not real dense right through here, but I can pull up a few stems or tillers of it here. Reed canary grass is a species that we also refer to often as being a cryptic species. And that simply means that it's hard to determine what its actual status should be in terms of native or non-native. It is known to be what's called a circumboreal species. So the species itself was native to all the continents, all around the northern latitudes. So North America did have native reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinacea, but that's probably not what we see, of course, in most of the environments that we have here. Instead, a cultivar that was developed in Europe to be used as erosion control, forage production. It was designed and genetically created to be very aggressive and reproduce vegetatively, so it would be good at holding the soil, especially in along terraces or in waterways. That's the cultivar. We have to just call it a cultivar, or a version of reed canary grass that, again, really is not native in that sense, because it's been changed. That's the form of reed canary grass that I think we mostly deal with. So it is a very difficult species to control. It's probably one of the most important problem species in wetlands, and especially sedge meadows, wet mesic prairies, places that, again, floodplain environments that have a somewhat damp soil. There are a variety of techniques. Again, we can talk more about this in the webinar. I'm actually conducting a study right now on a sedge meadow in Madison County, investigating different methods of controlling this species, basically looking at the use of fire, the use of mowing, and the use of clethodim, herbicide, in various combinations to see if we can, of course, remove the reed canary grass, but without damaging the native sedge meadow species that are still there. So more on that. The other one here, this is a double whammy. Not only, again, do we have this very invasive and difficult reed canary grass, I'm also standing in equally as difficult and invasive crown vetch. All of these, this patch of leaves here, I'm holding up a few leaves here that are examples of the compound, many small leaflets on these leaves here. Coronaria, I think the species name was Varia. That's changed now. I think the whole name has changed. We'll have to get that to you in the webinar. But crown vetch is, of course, another species that has the same kind of sad story. Brought here to control erosion, used quite widely to stabilize banks. It certainly can do that, but boy, once it gets away, doesn't have any of those formerly population control species from where it came. And in prairies especially, it can essentially take over areas and form these dense patches where not much else is going to grow. This one is equally as difficult, in my experience, to deal with. I'm using combination of mowing it at the right time with brush cutters, using fire, and then also using herbicide late in the growing season, usually right, in September or so, as multiple ways of stressing it, and that's what it's going to take to knock it back. So again, we can talk more about this during the webinar.
Okay, so that's the end of our video. There are just a couple, while we're finishing up here, there are a couple of comments, Tom. Let's see. I'll scroll up here. One is getting back to wild parsnip. They had good luck mowing to keep the wild parsnip at bay, and it really set it back to get rid of it pretty quickly. And honeysuckle, of course, as we all know, is a never-ending battle. Use of foliar spraying in October, November, and cutting and stump treatment whenever they have time. Let's see, the other comment for understory and timbers that's overtaken by honeysuckle, DNR Forester had indicated to Mark that they used aerial spraying via helicopter with water-tolerant Roundup after frost, while the honeysuckle are still green, but starting to translocate. John Pearson has done studies and determined no natives were negatively impacted doing this, and it was effective in killing the honeysuckle.
Yeah, that sounds like another option there. I didn't mention that. It is one that I've seen as well, because honeysuckle is non-native. It's not smart enough to know when winter is coming. So it hangs on to its leaves, which is, of course, an advantage in trying to control it quite much later than the native plants do. And I know that I suppose you could use, again, one of these herbicides that would be designed more to outright kill it. There's another one, though, that I think might be a little bit safer. It's called Krenite. What Krenite does is that it's only going to affect woody plants, so you don't have to worry about any of the herbaceous flora, which you would, of course, might have to worry about with other things. But what Krenite does is it's absorbed into the buds. The challenge there is you do have to get it on most of the leaves so that it gets absorbed into all of the buds of which are in the axils of those leaves. And it's a bud inhibitor then. And that means what happens then is that it can't leaf out. The next spring, it's not going to be able to leaf out. And so the plant's going to die. Before we run out of time, I do need to make one quick correction on the olive. I always have a hard time remembering which one has the rust-colored scales and which one doesn't. I tried to figure out little devices or mnemonic devices to help me remember that. So I had it backwards. The Russian olive, which is Elaeagnus angustifolia, does not have the rust-colored scales. It only has silvery scales. The other one, which would be then the one that we saw there, because it did have some rust-colored scales, usually just a few scattered of these reddish rust brown colored scales need to be present, but that one is Elaeagnus umbellata, autumn olive. So just to keep those two straight, they're, as far as the ecological concerns, they're both bad, both the same.
Okay, well, we better finish up here. I want to thank you very much, Tom, for presenting awesome questions and comments from our participants as well. So next time we'll be heading to Eastern Iowa in Lynn County to take a look at weeds and invasives in that part of the state. That will be in June. And Ben, if you could comment on today's certificate of attendance, that would be great. Ooh. Ben, are you there? So those will be provided as well for those of you that need them for professional development hours. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, and hopefully my video skills will improve. Actually, they'll be Ben's. So anyway, thanks so much for joining us all. Have a great day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.